A millionaire gets irritated by a baby's cry. His stern gaze seems to have no room for tenderness. But the mother holds the child and says a striking phrase. And in that moment, everything inside him begins to change. What do you think will happen in this story? Comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. On the top floor of the most imposing building on Fifth Avenue, where the New York City sky seemed bluer than anywhere else in the city, Reginald Vasconcelos meticulously analyzed the contract on his rosewood desk. His eyes, cold as the glass and steel walls that surrounded him, scanned every line, every comma, every word carefully chosen by his lawyers. At 45 years old, the businessman had built a real estate empire that stretched from New York City to the rest of the United States. His name was synonymous with power, but also with solitude. Any objections, Mr. Maurice? Reginald asked the lawyer sitting opposite him, without taking his eyes off the document. The contract is foolproof, Reginald. It covers all possibilities, including the non-contact clause after birth. The woman who accepts will be merely a— The lawyer hesitated, searching for the most appropriate term. A service provider. Temporary. Reginald nodded. It was exactly what he wanted. A practical solution to a practical problem. At 45, he had no heirs. His ex-wife, with whom he had lived in a marriage of convenience that lasted only 3 years, couldn't have children. Since their divorce more than a decade ago, he limited his relationships to fleeting encounters with women who understood the rules. No commitment, no feelings, no family. But something had changed in recent months. The diagnosis of a heart problem, though not serious, had made him rethink his legacy. We need to find the ideal candidate, Maurice continued, adjusting his glasses. Someone with no complicated family history. No vices, good health, and most importantly, no ambitions beyond what we're offering. The amount is generous enough to attract suitable candidates, Reginald replied, referring to the $2 million stipulated as payment. But I want absolute discretion. If the press finds out I'm looking for a surrogate, it will be hell. The secretary interrupted the conversation with a soft knock on the door. Mr. Vasconcelos, your brother Richard is here. Reginald frowned. Richard was the only family member he still kept in touch with, albeit distantly. 7 years younger, he was an ambitious man who hoped one day to take over part of his brother's business. Send him in, Reginald replied, quickly putting the contract away in a folder. Richard entered the room with the confidence of someone who feels at ease in any environment. He wore an impeccable Italian suit and displayed a calculated smile. Brother, am I interrupting something important? He asked, greeting his brother with an awkward hug that Reginald barely returned. Mr. Maurice and I were finalizing some details. Business as always, Reginald replied dryly. The lawyer bid farewell with a discreet bow and left the brothers alone. Richard poured himself a whiskey without asking permission and settled into an armchair. I heard you've been having medical exams, Richard commented, studying his brother's reaction. Any serious problems? Nothing that deserves your concern, Reginald cut him off. To what do I owe this visit? Family doesn't need reasons to see each other, Richard replied with feigned indignation. But since you asked, I came to talk about the construction company's expansion into the Southeast. I think we should reconsider the Miami project. While Richard discoursed about business, Reginald observed his brother with suspicion. Since their parents' death in a plane crash when they were still young, Richard had tried to prove his worth in the family business. Reginald, who was already managing the company at the time, had never fully trusted his brother, keeping him in secondary positions, far from the really important decisions. The conversation about business lasted for almost an hour, until Richard seemingly casually mentioned, I saw Aunt Eleanor last week. She asked if you're thinking of getting married again, starting a family. He paused deliberately. I told her you'd probably leave the construction company to some charity, since you don't have children. Reginald maintained an impassive expression, but he felt the blow. Richard had always been skilled at hitting his weak spots. My will is my business, he replied coldly, and tell Aunt Eleanor that my personal life remains personal. When he finally found himself alone, Reginald returned to the contract he was preparing. The conversation with his brother had only reinforced his decision. He needed an heir, someone to continue his legacy and prevent Richard from taking control of everything he had built with such sacrifice. A child would be the answer, not out of love or desire for family, but out of strategic necessity. Miles away, in the humble neighborhood of Queens, New York City, Marianne Rivers sat by the hospital bed where her mother, Mrs. Ida, rested. The public hospital room housed 3 other patients, all with tired faces and distant gazes. The smell of disinfectant couldn't completely mask the odor of illness that hung in the air. "Daughter, you don't have to spend the night here again," Mrs. Ida whispered, stroking Marianne's dark, wavy hair. "Go home, rest. You have a shift at the hospital tomorrow." Marianne shook her head. "I won't leave you alone, Mom. Patricia is with the kids today." At 28, Marianne was a nursing technician and worked at a private hospital in Brooklyn, New York City. She juggled her shifts with caring for her mother, who had been diagnosed with aggressive cancer 6 months ago. The treatment was expensive, far beyond what her salary could cover, even with the help of the public hospital system. The family's already scarce savings were quickly depleted by medications, transportation, and special meals. "Dr. Samantha spoke with me today," Mrs. Ida continued in a weak voice. "She said there's a new treatment that might help me." Marianne felt her heart tighten. She already knew this speech. Experimental treatments, imported medications, alternative therapies, all cost much more than they could afford. "We'll find a way, Mom," she replied, trying to sound confident. "I'll talk to my supervisor tomorrow about those extra hours." Mrs. Ida closed her eyes, overcome by fatigue. Marianne remained by her side, holding her hand, while she thought of all the doors she had knocked on in search of help. She had tried loans, sold the old car that was her only valuable asset, organized raffles with the help of her colleagues. Nothing seemed enough. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Patricia, her best friend since school. "Mari, I found something that might interest you. Urgent. Call me when you can." Intrigued, Marianne quietly left the room so as not to disturb her mother's and the other patients' sleep. In the dimly lit hospital corridor, she called her friend. "Pat, what happened?" "Mari, do you remember Juliana, who works with me at the lab? Her cousin is a nurse at a super fancy private clinic on the Upper East Side. They're looking for a woman to be, how can I put it? A surrogate for an important client." Marianne frowned. "A surrogate? Are you serious?" Totally. The payment is $2 million. Patricia paused dramatically. $2 million, Mari. That would pay for your mother's treatment at the best private hospital in the country and still leave plenty left over. Marianne felt her heart race. The amount mentioned was surreal. It seemed like something out of a movie. $2 million would solve not only the immediate problem of her mother's treatment, but would ensure comfort and security for both of them for many years. There must be some mistake. "Pat, nobody pays that much. He's a filthy rich guy. Mari, $2 million probably won't make a dent in his fortune." Juliana said it's all super discreet, with a contract and top-notch medical care. Marianne leaned against the cold corridor wall, feeling dizzy. She had never considered anything like this. The idea of carrying a child to give to someone else seemed frightening, almost inconceivable. But when she thought of her mother sleeping in that hospital bed, of the accumulating bills, of the prognosis that worsened every day without proper treatment, something changed within her. "How do I find out more?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Juliana said she can put you in touch with the clinic. They would do an initial interview. Medical exams." Patricia hesitated. "Mari, are you sure?" "It's a huge decision." Marianne looked through the half-open door at her sleeping mother. "I'm not sure of anything, Pat. I just know I can't lose her because I don't have the money to save her." That night, lying in an uncomfortable chair beside her mother's bed, Marianne couldn't sleep. She thought about what it would mean to carry a child for 9 months that wouldn't be hers, about the changes in her body, about the explanations she would have to give. But above all, she thought about the chance to save the person she loved most in the world. With this idea fixed in her mind, she made a decision that would forever change the course of her life, and unbeknownst to her, also the life of Reginald Vasconcelos. The New York City Assisted Reproduction Clinic occupied 3 floors of an elegant building in the Upper East Side. Its silent corridors, decorated with contemporary artworks and carefully arranged ornamental plants, conveyed a sense of exclusivity and discretion. It was a place where family dreams were realized, for those who could afford it. Marianne felt out of place in that environment. She looked at her simple uniform, jeans, a white blouse and a light jacket, and wondered if she should have dressed better for the interview. Sitting in the reception area, she watched elegant women entering and leaving, accompanied by equally well-dressed husbands, all with that air of someone who never needed to check their bank balance before a purchase. Ms. Rivers, an impeccably dressed receptionist, called out, "Dr. Eliza will see you now." Following the woman down a corridor, Marianne was led to a spacious room, where a middle-aged doctor with perfectly coiffed grey hair and a serene expression awaited her. "Marianne, welcome. I'm Dr. Eliza Wells, director of this clinic," the doctor introduced herself, indicating a comfortable armchair. "Patricia called me last night after speaking with you. She told me a little about your situation." Marianne nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "Thank you for seeing me, doctor. I confess I never thought about being a surrogate for someone." The doctor smiled gently. "I understand. It's a very serious decision. I'll explain exactly how the process works here at the clinic, and then you can decide if you want to proceed." Over the next hour, Dr. Eliza detailed the in vitro fertilization procedure, the necessary exams, the medical and psychological support Marianne would receive, and the legal issues involved. She explained that the client was a very important businessman who desired absolute discretion. The egg would be from an anonymous donor, selected based on characteristics compatible with the father, the doctor explained. You would be merely the gestational carrier, with no genetic link to the child. The word merely hit Marianne like a small blow. There was something cold in that way of describing the process, as if 9 months of pregnancy were a mere technical detail. "And after the birth?" Marianne asked, her voice lower than she intended. "The contract stipulates that you will have no contact with the child after delivery. It's a non-negotiable condition for the client." Marianne swallowed hard. The reality of what she was considering doing began to weigh on her shoulders. It wouldn't just be a commercial transaction. It would be giving birth to a child she could never see grow up. And the amount? Marianne hesitated. "The 2 million mentioned by Patricia, is that real?" Dr. Eliza confirmed with a nod. "The client is extremely generous. Half would be paid after confirmation of pregnancy, and the rest after the baby's birth. There's also a clause covering all your medical and living expenses during the gestation." Marianne's heart raced. With that money, she could provide her mother with the best possible treatment at a private clinic. She could move her out of the cramped apartment in Queens and buy a comfortable house, perhaps even near the beach where the fresh air would be good for her lungs. She could finally go back to studying, fulfill her dream of becoming an obstetric nurse. "I need to have tests first?" she asked, trying to organize her thoughts. "Yes, a complete battery. If everything is fine, and if the client approves your profile, we could start the process in a few weeks." When Marianne left the clinic an hour later, she carried a folder with detailed information and forms to fill out. Her head spun with possibilities and doubts. On the subway, on her way to the hospital where her mother was admitted, she observed the people around her, ordinary men and women with ordinary lives, ordinary problems. None of them probably had to make choices like the one she was facing now. At the hospital, she found Mrs. Ida sleeping. She sat silently beside her, observing the thin, pale face marked by suffering. How would she explain to her mother what she intended to do? Mrs. Ida was a simple woman with traditional values. She certainly wouldn't understand, perhaps even vehemently oppose it. But if she didn't tell the truth, what story would she invent to explain a sudden pregnancy? "Daughter? I didn't see you arrive?" Mrs. Ida's weak voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hi, Mom, how are you feeling today?" Marianne asked, holding her mother's cold hand in hers. "Better. Dr. Samantha said I can go home tomorrow." Mrs. Ida tried to smile, but a grimace of pain crossed her face. "What's wrong with you?" "You look worried." Marianne forced a smile. "Nothing, Mom, just tired. I had a job interview today." "Another job? But daughter, you already work so much." "It's a special job. Mom, it's going to help us solve everything." In the days that followed, Marianne underwent all the tests requested by the clinic. Each positive result brought her closer to the final decision. Her body was healthy, strong, perfectly capable of carrying a life. The doctor seemed satisfied, and the date to meet the client, the man who would be the father of the child she would carry, was set. Meanwhile, in Reginald Vasconcelos's office, the businessman reviewed the profiles of potential candidates selected by the clinic. Most had not passed a superficial analysis, too young, questionable medical history, confused motivations. Only 3 women had reached the final stage of the process, and among them, one stood out, Marianne Rivers, 28, a nursing technician. "This one seems ideal," Maurice commented, watching the businessman study the dossier. "Impeccable health, no vices, family history without worrying genetic diseases, and the motivation is clear and urgent, her sick mother." Reginald studied the photo attached to the profile. A young woman with olive skin, dark hair, and deep brown eyes that conveyed an unusual seriousness for her age. She wasn't the type of beauty that usually attracted him, but there was something in her expression, a determination, perhaps, that caught his attention. "Does she know who the client is?" Reginald asked, closing the folder. "No, only that he is a businessman who desires discretion, as you requested." Reginald nodded, satisfied. "I want to meet her personally before making the final decision." On the appointed day, Marianne returned to the clinic with her heart pounding. This time, she was led to a private meeting room on the top floor, elegantly and simply decorated. Dr. Eliza greeted her and asked her to wait a few minutes. "The client is on his way," the doctor informed her. "Remember, he values objectivity and discretion very much." Alone in the room, Marianne tried to control her nervousness. She had spent the entire week thinking about what she would say, how she would behave. She wanted to appear professional, not desperate, although desperation was exactly what had brought her there. The door opened, and Marianne instinctively stood up. A tall man of imposing stature entered, accompanied by a shorter man carrying a leather briefcase. The first, wearing a tailored suit that highlighted his position, had graying temples and a penetrating gaze that immediately intimidated Marianne. "Miss Rivers, I am Reginald Vasconcelos," the man introduced himself, extending his hand in a formal greeting. "And this is Maurice Bell, my lawyer." Marianne shook the extended hand, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Pleased to meet you." "Please sit down," Reginald said, indicating the chair she had occupied before. He and the lawyer sat on the other side of the table, creating a distance that seemed both physical and symbolic. "Dr. Eliza informed me that you passed all your exams with excellent results," Reginald began, getting straight to the point. "I also read your profile. Nursing technician, experience in maternity, no history of serious diseases in the family. Your mother is the exception, as I understand it." Marianne nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, my mother is undergoing treatment for advanced cancer." "That's why." "Well, that's why I'm here." Reginald studied the young woman carefully. There was a dignity in her posture, despite her obvious nervousness. She didn't seem like the type of person to make such a serious decision on impulse. "I understand your situation, and I respect your motivation," he said after a moment. "But I need to be sure that you fully understand what you are proposing to do. It's not just a commercial transaction. It's a 9-month responsibility that will require total dedication." "I understand," Marianne replied, meeting his gaze. "I work in healthcare. I know what a pregnancy involves, the risks, the changes in the body, the necessary commitment. I am not making this decision lightly." Something in the firmness of her response seemed to please Reginald. He looked at the lawyer, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "And what about after birth?" the businessman asked, leaning slightly forward. "The contract clearly stipulates that you will have no contact with the child. Ever. Can you accept that condition?" The question hit Marianne like a cold blade. It was the question she herself had asked countless times in recent days. Could she carry a life inside her for 9 months, and then simply hand over the child like handing over a package? Never see him again? Never know how he was if he was happy? Alison, she hesitated briefly. "I accept that condition. I understand that I will have no rights over the child. I will not be the mother, just the gestational carrier." Reginald kept his eyes fixed on her as if trying to see beyond her words, to assess her sincerity. For a moment, silence weighed heavily in the room. "Very well," he finally said, turning to the lawyer. "Maurice, show Miss Rivers the contract." The lawyer opened the briefcase he carried and pulled out a multi-page document. He handed it to Marianne along with a pen. There are 5 copies, Maurice explained. It contains all the clauses that have already been explained by Dr. Eliza. Payment, confidentiality, medical follow-up, restrictions during pregnancy, and of course the legal transfer of the child after birth. Marianne began to leaf through the document, trying to absorb the complex legal terms. She felt Reginald's gaze on her, evaluating every reaction. At one point she looked up and met his eyes. "Something wrong?" The businessman asked. "No, just, it's a lot to take in at once," she replied honestly. "Understandable. You can take the contract home. Consult a lawyer if you wish," Reginald offered, surprising both Marianne and Maurice himself. "I want you to make this decision with full awareness of what you are doing." Marianne nodded, grateful for the unexpected consideration. "Thank you. I promise not to delay with my answer." When the meeting ended, Reginald watched the young woman leave the room with the contract in her hand. There was something about her, a combination of fragility and strength, that intrigued him. "What do you think?" Maurice asked, putting away his documents. "She seems suitable," Reginald replied with his usual economy of words. "Schedule the procedure for 2 weeks from now, if she accepts the terms." As Marianne returned home on the crowded subway, the contract carefully tucked into her purse, she reflected on the man she had met. Reginald Vasconcelos seemed the personification of power and control, someone accustomed to buying what he wanted, when he wanted it. Why would such a man, who could certainly have any woman, choose this solitary path to have a child? There was something in his eyes, a loneliness perhaps, that for an instant made her see beyond the facade of an ruthless businessman. In the small apartment in Queens, Marianne found Mrs. Ida watching television in the living room. Since returning from the hospital, her mother seemed more fragile, moving with difficulty and resting most of the time. "Hi, Mum. How are you feeling today?" "Better, daughter. And you? You look tired." Marianne sat beside her mother, holding her wrinkled hand in hers. "Mom, I need to tell you something important. Something that could change our lives." The explanation to Mrs. Ida was more difficult than Marianne had imagined. After hours of conversation, tears and arguments, she opted for a half-truth that, though painful, was more acceptable to her mother than the complete reality. She told her that she had been selected for a special program at the clinic where she worked, a study that paid very well to women willing to be surrogates for couples who couldn't have children. "But daughter, to carry a baby and then give it away." "That's not right," Mrs. Ida argued, wiping her tears with an already damp tissue. "You'll get attached, you'll suffer." "Mom, I know what I'm doing," Marianne replied firmly. "I'm a nurse, I work with pregnant women every day. I know how to separate the professional from the personal." The lie weighed on her conscience. It wasn't a couple, it was a solitary rich man. It wasn't a clinical study, but a private contract with figures she never dared mention to her mother. But the full truth would be too much for Mrs. Ida to bear in her fragile state. 2 weeks later, the contract signed and the medical procedure scheduled, Marianne arrived at the clinic for the embryo transfer. Dr. Eliza greeted her with a reassuring smile. "Are you ready, Marianne? Today could be the day that changes your life." The procedure was quick and painless. Lying on the examination table, Marianne tried not to think too much about what was happening. An embryo, created in the laboratory, with Reginald Vasconcelos' sperm and an anonymous donor's egg, would be implanted in her uterus. If all went well, in a few weeks she would officially be pregnant. As the doctor performed the procedure, Marianne closed her eyes and thought of her mother, of the treatment she could provide her, of the new house they would buy, of the better life they would have. That's why she was there, she repeated to herself. For love, not for money. On the 20th day after the procedure, the pregnancy test was positive. Dr. Eliza, with a satisfied smile, was the first to give Marianne the news, and immediately informed Reginald Vasconcelos. The first payment was made the same day, $1 million transferred to an account Marianne had opened specifically for that purpose. Seeing that number in her bank account, Marianne felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was more money than she had ever imagined having, and now the responsibility was equally monumental. She immediately transferred part of the amount to begin Mrs. Ida's treatment at a specialized private oncology clinic, considered one of the best in the country. "How did you get all that money, daughter?" her mother asked, astonished by the sudden change in her circumstances. from the public system to a private room overlooking Central Park. The program I told you about, Mom, they pay very well, Marianne replied, averting her gaze, and I want you to have the best possible treatment. The following week, to Marianne's surprise, she received a call from Reginald Vasconcelos' secretary. Miss Rivers, Mr. Vasconcelos would like to accompany you to your next prenatal appointment. Would that be possible? Marianne hesitated. The contract didn't require his presence at appointments, only regular medical reports. What did Reginald Vasconcelos want? Of course, she finally replied. The next appointment is on Monday at 10 a.m. On the appointed date, Marianne arrived at the clinic and found Reginald already waiting for her in the private room reserved for pregnancy follow-up. He wore an impeccable grey suit and seemed out of place in that clinical environment. "Good morning, Miss Rivers," he greeted her formally. "I hope I'm not causing any inconvenience." "Good morning, Mr. Vasconcelos. It's no inconvenience at all," Marianne replied, trying to maintain her composure. There was something intimidating about his presence, an aura of power and control that made her uncomfortable. Dr. Eliza entered the room with her usual professional smile. "Good morning to both of you. Shall we check on our baby?" The use of the word "our" made Marianne stiffen slightly, but Reginald didn't seem to notice. The doctor asked Marianne to lie on the examination table and lift her blouse to expose her still flat belly. The cold ultrasound gel made her shiver. "Here it is," the doctor said, pointing to the tiny speck on the screen. "It's still very early, but this little dot here is the embryo. In a few weeks, we'll be able to hear the heartbeat." Marianne watched the screen with a strange sensation. A life was growing inside her, but it wasn't her child. It was just a job. She tried to remind herself of that, ignoring the slight tingling of emotion she felt. When she looked to the side, she was surprised by Reginald's expression. The businessman, normally so controlled, was staring intently at the screen with something that looked like admiration or astonishment. For a brief moment, his mask of an unshakable businessman seemed to disappear. "It's always incredible, isn't it?" the doctor commented, noticing his reaction. "Even though it's just a tiny dot at this stage, it's already a life." "Yes," Reginald replied dryly, quickly composing himself. "When will we know the baby's sex?" "Around the 16th week if the baby cooperates," the doctor explained. "But we can do a genetic test before that if you wish." At the end of the appointment, as Marianne adjusted her clothes, Reginald remained in the room as if he wanted to say something. The doctor had left to get vitamin prescriptions. "Miss Rivers," he began hesitantly, a characteristic Marianne would never associate with him, "I want to thank you for what you're doing. I know it's not easy." Surprised by the display of gratitude, Marianne merely nodded. "I'm fulfilling my part of the agreement." "Even so," he insisted, "I want you to know that I will accompany you to all appointments, if you don't mind. I would like to be present at every stage." Marianne didn't know how to respond. The contract she had signed didn't foresee this kind of involvement. In fact, she had imagined that after the pregnancy was confirmed, she would barely see Reginald Vasconcelos until the baby's birth. "All right," she finally replied. "It's your child, after all." A strange silence hung between them. The word child seemed to have given concreteness to something that until then existed only as an abstract concept. In the weeks that followed, to Marianne's surprise, Reginald not only attended all the appointments, but also began to call regularly to ask how she was feeling. At first, the calls were formal, almost clinical, questions about morning sickness, diet, discomforts. But gradually, something began to change. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when Marianne was experiencing severe morning sickness, her cell phone rang. It was Reginald, asking about the appointment they had had that morning. "I'm fine," she lied, trying to control her nausea. "Just a little tired." "Your voice sounds different," he observed. "Are you feeling nauseous again?" His perception surprised her. "Yes, a little, but I'm used to it now. Dr. Eliza told me about a tea that might help. I'm sending my driver with some herbs," she recommended. "He should arrive in an hour." Before Marianne could protest, he had hung up. An hour later, a man in uniform delivered a basket to her door with various types of teas, ginger cookies, and a small sound system with relaxing music. The gesture disconcerted her. It didn't fit the cold, calculating image she had of Reginald Vasconcelos. There was a concern there that went beyond interest in the product she was carrying, his child. In the 12th week, during a routine checkup, Dr. Eliza smiled as she positioned the ultrasound device over Marianne's already slightly rounded belly. "We're going to listen to the heart today," the doctor announced. A rhythmic, accelerated sound filled the room. Marianne felt something tighten in her own chest. It was real, so real and alive. Unable to contain herself, her eyes filled with tears. When she looked to the side, she saw that Reginald was also visibly moved. His eyes, normally cold and analytical, shone with an unusual moistness. For an instant their gazes met, united by that sound, the heart of the baby that connected them in a way no contract could foresee. "It's incredible," Reginald murmured, more to himself than to the others in the room. That night, alone at home, Marianne found herself caressing her belly and talking to the baby, something she had promised herself she wouldn't do. The bond she was trying to avoid was beginning to form, against her will and her better judgment. "I can't get attached," she whispered to the silence of the room. "You're not mine." But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she not get attached to a life growing inside her, feeding on her blood, responding to her hormones, already beginning to move subtly in her womb? Meanwhile, in the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Reginald Vasconcelos faced his own internal conflicts. Sitting in his office, with a folder of important documents neglected on his desk, he couldn't stop thinking about the ultrasound image, the sound of the baby's heart, and Marianne's expression when she heard it. There was something about her, a genuine vulnerability, a humanity, that contrasted deeply with the artificial women he usually knew in his social circle. Marianne was real, authentic in her emotions, and that, without him realizing it, was beginning to break down the walls he had built around himself. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Richard. "Hello, little brother. I heard you've been frequently visiting a clinic on the Upper East Side. Health problems I should know about?" The seemingly casual question made Reginald grip the phone tightly. How did Richard know about his visits to the clinic? Was he being followed? "My health is excellent, Richard. And my personal life remains exactly that, personal." Of course," his brother replied with false cordiality. "I'm just concerned. After all, we're family, aren't we?" The only family left to each other. The word family in Richard's mouth sounded like a veiled threat. Since childhood, his younger brother had shown a special talent for manipulation and power games. Their parents' death had only accentuated this characteristic, transforming the brothers' relationship into a constant, silent struggle for control of the family legacy. "Thank you for your concern," Reginald replied coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Hanging up the phone, Reginald remained motionless for a few moments. Richard was investigating him, trying to find out about the baby. This posed a risk he hadn't initially foreseen. His brother would not react well to the news of an heir who would threaten his position in the company and his plans for the future. His cell phone rang again. This time it was a message from Marianne. "The baby is moving. It's the first time I've felt it clearly. I thought you'd like to know." The simplicity and sincerity of the message evoked an emotion in Reginald that he hadn't felt in a long time, something close to pure happiness, without calculations or strategies. He replied immediately, "Thank you for sharing that with me. It means a lot." He typed the message and sent it before he could rationalize what he was doing. This wasn't how he usually acted, impulsively, emotionally. For years, every word, every gesture, every decision was meticulously calculated. But something was changing inside him, and this change both frightened and fascinated him. The next day, Reginald did something that would surprise anyone who knew him well. He cancelled 3 important meetings and drove personally to Queens, the neighborhood where Marianne still lived, despite the money she now possessed. The contrast between his Porsche Cayenne and the simple streets of the neighborhood couldn't have been greater. He parked in front of the small apartment building and hesitated before getting out of the car. What was he doing there? What was his objective? He hadn't planned this visit. There was no logical reason for him to be there. Before he could decide whether to continue or return to the safe comfort of his world, his phone rang. It was his secretary, informing him of a business emergency that required his immediate presence. Simultaneously relieved and frustrated, Reginald started the car and drove away, looking in the rearview mirror at the building where Marianne lived. What was happening to him? Why did he care so much about that woman, who was nothing more than a service provider, according to the contract he himself had drafted? The answer, which he wasn't yet ready to admit, was simple. Marianne was humanizing him, awakening feelings he had thought extinct. And that was dangerous. Dangerous for his plans, dangerous for his meticulously controlled life, dangerous above all for his long-dormant heart. That night, in his luxurious apartment, Reginald opened a drawer he kept locked and took out a small wooden box. Inside it, a single photograph, himself as a child with his parents before the accident that took them. In the image, his mother held his hand, smiling with that unconditional love that only mothers seem capable of giving. "What would you do in my place?" he asked softly, as if the woman in the photograph could answer. "How do you protect a child in a world like ours?" The question hung in the air unanswered. But something within Reginald was beginning to change, like a river slowly altering its course after decades of following the same path. Mrs. Ida's treatment at the private clinic showed promising results. The doctors spoke of partial remission, a term that sounded like music to Marianne's ears, seeing her regain her strength day after day, her appetite gradually returning, the color returning to her previously pale face. It was like witnessing a miracle that justified all her choices. "Daughter, you're different," Mrs. Ida commented one Sunday afternoon, as they both had tea on the small balcony of the apartment. "It's not just your belly growing, for it's something in your eyes." Marianne looked away, pretending to adjust the pillow supporting her back. She was in her 5th month of pregnancy, and her belly was already clearly pronounced under the light dress she wore. "It must be tiredness. Mom, the hospital shifts, the appointments—" "It's not tiredness," Mrs. Ida insisted, with a perceptiveness that not even the illness could diminish. "It's a different sparkle. You're getting attached to the baby, aren't you?" The question hit Marianne like a punch. It was exactly what had been happening, no matter how much she tried to deny it to herself. Every movement, every ultrasound, every heartbeat heard during the appointments strengthened a bond that shouldn't exist. "I can't get attached." "Mom," she finally replied, the words almost catching in her throat. "You know I can't." Mrs. Ida held her daughter's hand with surprising firmness for someone in her condition. "Marianne, no woman carries a child for 9 months without forming a bond. It's nature. It's what makes us human. But the contracts are just paper, daughter. Feelings are something else." Marianne didn't answer. How could she explain to her mother that, in addition to getting attached to the baby, another equally forbidden feeling was beginning to blossom in her heart? A feeling for the man who, technically, was just the contractor for her services. In recent weeks, Reginald Vasconcelos had become a constant presence in her life. Not just at medical appointments, but in almost daily calls, unexpected gifts, genuine concerns for her well-being. There was a kindness in him that completely contradicted the cold, calculating figure from their first meeting. The previous week, after they discovered the baby would be a boy, Reginald surprised her by taking her to lunch at a discreet restaurant on the Upper East Side. It was the first time they had met outside the clinical setting, and the conversation, initially focused on the pregnancy, gradually drifted to personal matters. "Why did you decide to be a nurse?" he asked, observing her with genuine interest. "My grandmother was a midwife in rural Pennsylvania," Marianne replied, surprised by the ease with which she opened up. "I grew up hearing her stories about bringing lives into the world. When she got sick, the nurses who took care of her at the hospital were so kind, so human. I decided I wanted to do the same for others." Reginald listened with rare attention, as if every word was important. It was a stark contrast to the men Marianne had known before, always rushed, always distracted, always with their attention divided between her and their phone. "And you?" she asked, gaining courage. "Why did you choose this path to have a child? Alone, I mean." The question clearly surprised him. For a moment, Marianne feared she had crossed some invisible line. But Reginald, after a moment of hesitation, replied with an honesty she didn't expect. "I never found someone I wanted to share my life with, or perhaps I never allowed anyone to get close enough." He paused as if weighing his next words. "My parents died when I was young. Since then, I've learned to trust only myself, to control everything around me so as not to be hurt again. That sounds like a lonely life, Marianne commented, softly. It is, he admitted with a sad smile, but I'm trying to change that. For him. He pointed to Marianne's belly. I don't want my son to grow up with a father incapable of showing affection. That unexpected confession created an intimacy between them that transcended the commercial agreement that had united them. For the first time, Marianne saw beyond the facade of a successful businessman. She saw the vulnerable man, marked by losses and fears, trying to find his way back to the humanity he had suppressed. Now, sitting with her mother on the simple balcony of the apartment in Queens, Marianne wondered how it would all end. In 4 months, the baby would be born, the contract would be concluded, and their lives would go their separate ways. It was agreed, arranged, signed in 5 copies. But would it really be possible to go back, to pretend that nothing had happened, that no feelings had been born? What are you thinking about, Mrs.? Ida asked, interrupting her thoughts. About the future, Mum, about what comes next. After the birth. Marianne nodded, unable to elaborate. How would she explain to her mother that her thoughts about the future now included not only the baby, but also Reginald? It was a foolish fantasy, she knew that. An improbable fairy tale, the humble nurse and the powerful businessman, united by a child who legally would be only his. Her cell phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Patricia. Marie, you won't believe it, her friend began, without even taking time for a greeting. There's an imported car parked out front of the building, and there's a man asking for your apartment. He looks like a businessman or something. Marianne's heart raced. What does he look like? Tall, greying at the temples, well-dressed. Quite handsome, if you ask me. Patricia paused. Marie, who is this man? Does he have anything to do with, you know? She pointed to Marianne's belly. I'll tell you everything later, I promise, Marianne replied, heading for the exit. What's wrong, daughter? Mrs. Ida asked, worried about the sudden agitation. I have to go downstairs for a moment, Mum. It's someone from the hospital. She hurried down the building stairs as fast as her condition allowed, ignoring the old, slow elevator. On the ground floor, she found Patricia in the lobby, her eyes wide with curiosity. He's out there, her friend whispered. Marie, who is this man? Does it have anything to do with, you know? She pointed to Marianne's belly. I'll tell you everything later, I promise, Marianne replied, heading for the exit. Reginald Vasconcelos was standing beside his car, hands in his coat pockets, looking strangely out of place in that simple environment. When he saw Marianne, his face lit up with a smile she had never seen before, genuine, almost boyish in its spontaneity. Sorry to show up unannounced, he said, walking towards her. I was in the area and... He stopped, as if realizing the absurdity of the lie. Reginald Vasconcelos was not in the area of Queens casually on a Sunday. Actually, I wanted to see you, see how you're doing. Marianne felt a flush rise to her face. I'm fine, we're fine, she replied, instinctively placing her hand on her belly. A strange silence hung between them, full of unspoken things, of unadmitted feelings. Want to go for a walk? He finally asked. There's a park nearby, isn't there? Marianne nodded. Forest Park was just a few minutes away, a rare green space in that densely populated area of the city. I just need to tell my mother. Minutes later, the two walked side by side along one of the park's paths. It was strange to see Reginald there, his Italian shoes treading on dry leaves, his expensive coat contrasting with the simplicity of the surroundings. But there was something natural in the way they walked together, as if their bodies knew something their minds still hesitated to accept. How is your mother? He asked, breaking the silence. Better. The doctors are optimistic. The new treatment is working. Reginald smiled. I'm happy to hear that. They walked a few more steps in silence until he stopped and turned to face her. Marianne, I need to tell you something. His expression was serious, almost grave. My brother, Richard, is investigating my visits to the clinic. I believe he suspects about the baby. The statement caught Marianne off guard. And is that a problem? It could be. Richard has always had ambitions regarding the company. A direct heir would threaten his plans. Would he do something against his own nephew? Marianne asked, instinctively protective. Not directly, Reginald replied, choosing his words carefully. But Richard is skilled at manipulating situations, people, contracts. If he finds out about you, about our situation, he might try to use it in some way. Marianne felt a shiver. That had nothing to do with the breeze blowing in the park. For the first time, she realized that she had entered a much more complex and dangerous world than she had imagined. A world of fortunes, power, and family intrigues. "He doesn't know about me, does he?" she asked, suddenly alert. "Not yet, as far as I can tell. But he's trying to find out." Reginald hesitated, as if weighing the impact of his next words. "Marianne, I've been thinking, perhaps it would be safer if you moved to a more protected place until the baby is born." "More protected," she repeated, not fully understanding. "I have a house in Greenwich, Connecticut. Isolated, secure, with all the necessary infrastructure. You and your mother could move there. You'd have nurses to care for her, 24-hour security, everything you'd need." Marianne took a step back, stunned by the suggestion. "You want my mother and me to move into your house? That wasn't in the contract, Reginald." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, she realized too late. It had always been Mr. Vasconcelos, maintaining the formality the agreement required. But something had changed between them, and they both knew it. "I know it wasn't in the contract," he replied, approaching her again. "But a lot has changed since we signed that paper. Don't you think?" The question hung between them, loaded with implicit meanings. Yes, a lot had changed. What had started as a cold, calculated transaction had turned into something more, something neither of them dared to name yet. "I need to think," Marianne finally replied. "I need to talk to my mother." Reginald nodded, respecting her hesitation. "Of course, take all the time you need." They walked back to Marianne's building in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people processing profound changes in their lives, re-evaluating paths, reconsidering possibilities. At their parting, something unexpected happened. When Marianne extended her hand for a formal handshake, Reginald held it in his and, in a surprisingly intimate gesture, brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything you're doing, not just for the baby." Before Marianne could respond, he got into his car and drove off, leaving her with a confusion of feelings she had never expected to experience. Back in the apartment, she found Mrs. Ida asleep on the sofa, the television on at a low volume. She watched her mother for a moment, her face rosier, her breathing more regular. The treatment was working, and that was all that mattered, or at least that's what she tried to convince herself. She walked to the window and looked down at the street where minutes earlier Reginald had been. What was happening to her? How had she allowed such complex feelings to develop in a situation that was supposed to be purely professional? Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was Reginald. "Just to confirm, I arrived home safely. Thank you for the walk. It was the best Sunday I've had in years." Marianne smiled at the phone, feeling like a teenager. She typed and deleted several replies before finally sending, "I enjoyed it too. Take care." Simple, restrained, but sincere. How would it be possible to maintain this restraint in the months to come? How would she hand over the baby, her baby, for that's how she was beginning to think of him, and go on with her life as if nothing had happened? And how would she ignore the growing feelings for the man who ironically had paid to have a child without emotional involvement, but who now seemed as involved as she was? As these questions swirled in her mind, Marianne did not realize she was being watched. Across the street, inside a dark car with tinted windows, a man was taking pictures of her at the window. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Richard Vasconcelos smiled with satisfaction. "So this is what my brother is hiding," he murmured, examining the images on the camera. "A surrogate, an heir on the way." His smile widened, calculating. "Interesting. Very interesting." The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. "What do you want us to do now, sir?" "Now we're going to find out everything about this woman," Richard replied, putting away the camera. Every detail of her life, every weakness, every vulnerability. He looked once more at the simple building. My nephew or niece may be growing in her belly, but that doesn't mean Reginald won. The game has only just begun. In his luxurious penthouse apartment, Reginald Vasconcelos also stood at the window, contemplating the city that stretched out at his feet. For the first time in years, he felt alive, truly alive. His heart, so long dormant beneath layers of self-control and distrust, pulsed with a feeling he dared not name, but which he recognized as dangerously close to love. "What am I getting myself into?" he murmured to the window pane, which reflected his solitary image against the New York City skyline. But despite the question, something within him already knew the answer. He was finally allowing himself to feel, allowing himself to be vulnerable. And there was no turning back. Mrs. Ida's treatment at the private clinic showed promising results. The doctors spoke of partial remission, a term that sounded like music to Marianne's ears. Seeing her regain her strength day after day, her appetite gradually returning, the color returning to her previously pale face, it was like witnessing a miracle that justified all her choices. "Daughter, you're different," Mrs. Ida commented one Sunday afternoon, as they both had tea on the small balcony of the apartment. "It's not just your belly growing, it's something in your eyes." Marianne looked away, pretending to adjust the pillow supporting her back. She was in her 5th month of pregnancy, and her belly was already clearly pronounced under the light dress she wore. It must be tiredness. "Mom, the hospital shifts, the appointments." "It's not tiredness," Mrs. Ida insisted, with a perceptiveness that not even the illness could diminish. "It's a different sparkle. You're getting attached to the baby, aren't you?" The question hit Marianne like a punch. It was exactly what had been happening, no matter how much she tried to deny it to herself. Every movement, every ultrasound, every heartbeat heard during the appointments strengthened a bond that shouldn't exist. "I can't get attached." "Mom," she finally replied, the words almost catching in her throat. "You know I can't." Mrs. Ida held her daughter's hand with surprising firmness for someone in her condition. "Marianne, no woman carries a child for 9 months without forming a bond. It's nature. It's what makes us human. But the contracts are just paper, daughter. Feelings are something else." Marianne didn't answer. How could she explain to her mother that, in addition to getting attached to the baby, another equally forbidden feeling was beginning to blossom in her heart? A feeling for the man who technically was just the contractor for her services. In recent weeks, Reginald Vasconcelos had become a constant presence in her life, not just at medical appointments, but in almost daily calls, unexpected gifts, genuine concerns for her well-being. There was a kindness in him that completely contradicted the cold, calculating figure from their first meeting. The previous week, after they discovered the baby would be a boy, Reginald surprised her by taking her to lunch at a discreet restaurant on the Upper East Side. It was the first time they had met outside the clinical setting, and the conversation, initially focused on the pregnancy, gradually drifted to personal matters. "Why did you decide to be a nurse?" he asked, observing her with genuine interest. "My grandmother was a midwife in rural Pennsylvania," Marianne replied, surprised by the ease with which she opened up. "I grew up hearing her stories about bringing lives into the world. When she got sick, the nurses who took care of her at the hospital were so kind, so human. I decided I wanted to do the same for others." Reginald listened with rare attention, as if every word was important. It was a stark contrast to the men Marianne had known before, always rushed, always distracted, always with their attention divided between her and their phone. "And you?" she asked, gaining courage. "Why did you choose this path to have a child? Alone, I mean." The question clearly surprised him. For a moment, Marianne feared she had crossed some invisible line. But Reginald, after a moment of hesitation, replied with an honesty she didn't expect. "I never found someone I wanted to share my life with. Or perhaps I never allowed anyone to get close enough." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "My parents died when I was young. Since then, I've learned to trust only myself, to control everything around me so as not to be hurt again." "That sounds like a lonely life," Marianne commented softly. "It is," he admitted, with a sad smile. "But I'm trying to change that. For him," He pointed to Marianne's belly. I don't want my son to grow up with a father incapable of showing affection. That unexpected confession created an intimacy between them that transcended the commercial agreement that had united them. For the first time, Marianne saw beyond the facade of a successful businessman. She saw the vulnerable man, marked by losses and fears, trying to find his way back to the humanity he had suppressed. Now, sitting with her mother on the simple balcony of the apartment in Queens, Marianne wondered how it would all end. In 4 months the baby would be born, the contract would be concluded, and their lives would go their separate ways. It was agreed, arranged, signed in 5 copies. But would it really be possible to go back, to pretend that nothing had happened, that no feelings had been born? What are you thinking about? Mrs. Ida asked, interrupting her thoughts. About the future, Mom, about what comes next. After the birth? Marianne nodded, unable to elaborate. How would she explain to her mother that her thoughts about the future now included not only the baby, but also Reginald? It was a foolish fantasy, she knew that, an improbable fairy tale. The humble nurse and the powerful businessman, united by a child who legally would be only his. Her cell phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Patricia. Mary, you won't believe it, her friend began without even taking time for a greeting. There's an imported car parked out front of the building, and there's a man asking for your apartment. He looks like a businessman or something. Marianne's heart raced. What does he look like? Tall, graying at the temples, well-dressed. Quite handsome, if you ask me. Patricia paused. Mari, who is this man? Does he have anything to do with... You know, she pointed to Marianne's belly. I'll tell you everything later, I promise, Marianne replied, heading for the exit. What's wrong, daughter? Mrs. Ida asked, worried about the sudden agitation. I have to go downstairs for a moment, Mom. It's someone from the hospital. She hurried down the building stairs as fast as her condition allowed, ignoring the old, slow elevator. On the ground floor, she found Patricia in the lobby, her eyes wide with curiosity. He's out there, her friend whispered. Mari, who is this man? Does it have anything to do with... You know, she pointed to Marianne's belly. I'll tell you everything later. I promise, Marianne replied, heading for the exit. Reginald Vasconcelos was standing beside his car, hands in his coat pockets, looking strangely out of place in that simple environment. When he saw Marianne, his face lit up with a smile she had never seen before, genuine, almost boyish in its spontaneity. Sorry to show up unannounced, he said, walking towards her. I was in the area and... He stopped, as if realizing the absurdity of the lie. Reginald Vasconcelos was not in the area of Queens casually on a Sunday. Actually, I wanted to see you. See how you're doing? Marianne felt a flush rise to her face. I'm fine. We're fine, she replied, instinctively placing her hand on her belly. A strange silence hung between them, full of unspoken things, of unadmitted feelings. Want to go for a walk? He finally asked. There's a park nearby, isn't there? Marianne nodded. Forest Park was just a few minutes away. A rare green space in that densely populated area of the city. I just need to tell my mother. Minutes later, the two walked side by side along one of the park's paths. It was strange to see Reginald there, his Italian shoes treading on dry leaves, his expensive coat contrasting with the simplicity of the surroundings. But there was something natural in the way they walked together, as if their bodies knew something their minds still hesitated to accept. How is your mother? He asked, breaking the silence. Better. The doctors are optimistic. The new treatment is working. Reginald smiled. I'm happy to hear that. They walked a few more steps in silence until he stopped and turned to face her. Marianne, I need to tell you something. His expression was serious, almost grave. My brother, Richard, is investigating my visits to the clinic. I believe he suspects about the baby. The statement caught Marianne off guard. And is that a problem? It could be. Richard has always had ambitions regarding the company. A direct heir would threaten his plans. Would he do something against his own nephew? Marianne asked, instinctively protective. Not directly, Reginald replied, choosing his words carefully. But Richard is skilled at manipulating situations, people, contracts. If he finds out about you, about our situation, he might try to use it in some way. Marianne felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the breeze blowing in the park. For the first time, she realized that she had entered a much more complex and dangerous world than she had imagined. A world of fortunes, power and family intrigues. He doesn't know about me, does he? She asked, suddenly alert. Not yet, as far as I can tell, but he's trying to find out. Reginald hesitated, as if weighing the impact of his next words. Marianne, I've been thinking. Perhaps it would be safer if you moved to a more protected place until the baby is born. More protected? She repeated, not fully understanding. I have a house in Greenwich, Connecticut. Isolated, secure, with all the necessary infrastructure. You and your mother could move there. You'd have nurses to care for her, 24-hour security, everything you'd need. Marianne took a step back, stunned by the suggestion. You want my mother and me to move into your house? That wasn't in the contract, Reginald. It was the first time she had called him by his first name, she realized too late. It had always been Mr. Vasconcelos, maintaining the formality the agreement required. But something had changed between them, and they both knew it. I know it wasn't in the contract, he replied, approaching her again, but a lot has changed since we signed that paper. Don't you think? The question hung between them, loaded with implicit meanings. Yes, a lot had changed. What had started as a cold, calculated transaction had turned into something more, something neither of them dared to name yet. I need to think, Marianne finally replied. I need to talk to my mother. Reginald nodded, respecting her hesitation. Of course. Take all the time you need. They walked back to Marianne's building in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people processing profound changes in their lives, re-evaluating paths, reconsidering possibilities. At their parting, something unexpected happened. When Marianne extended her hand for a formal handshake, Reginald held it in his and, in a surprisingly intimate gesture, brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. Thank you, he whispered, for everything you're doing, not just for the baby. Before Marianne could respond, he got into his car and drove off, leaving her with a confusion of feelings she had never expected to experience. Back in the apartment, she found Mrs. Eda asleep on the sofa, the television on at a low volume. She watched her mother for a moment, her face rosier, her breathing more regular. The treatment was working, and that was all that mattered. Or at least that's what she tried to convince herself. She walked to the window and looked down at the street, where minutes earlier Reginald had been. What was happening to her? How had she allowed such complex feelings to develop in a situation that was supposed to be purely professional? Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was Reginald. Just to confirm I arrived home safely. Thank you for the walk. It was the best Sunday I've had in years. Marianne smiled at the phone, feeling like a teenager. She typed and deleted several replies before finally sending, I enjoyed it too. Take care. Simple, restrained, but sincere. How would it be possible to maintain this containment in the months to come? How would she hand over the baby, her baby, for that's how she was beginning to think of him, and go on with her life as if nothing had happened? And how would she ignore the growing feelings for the man who, ironically, had paid to have a child without emotional involvement, but who now seemed as involved as she was? As these questions swirled in her mind, Marianne did not realize she was being watched. Across the street, inside a dark car with tinted windows, a man was taking pictures of her at the window. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Richard Vasconcelos smiled with satisfaction. So this is what my brother is hiding, he murmured, examining the images on the camera. A surrogate. An heir on the way. His smile widened, calculating. Interesting. Very interesting. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. What do you want us to do now, sir? Now we're going to find out everything about this woman, Richard replied, putting away the camera. Every detail of her life, every weakness, every vulnerability. He looked once more at the simple building. My nephew or niece may be growing in her belly, but that doesn't mean Reginald won. The game has only just begun. In his luxurious penthouse apartment, Reginald Vasconcelos also stood at the window, contemplating the city that stretched out at his feet. For the first time in years, he felt alive, truly alive. His heart, so long dormant beneath layers of self-control and distrust, pulsed with a feeling he dared not name, but which he recognized as dangerously close to love. What am I getting myself into? He murmured to the windowpane, which reflected his solitary image against the New York City skyline. But despite the question, something within him already knew the answer. He was finally allowing himself to feel, allowing himself to be vulnerable. And there was no turning back. Richard Vasconcelos intently observed the photographs scattered across his office desk, images of Marianne at different moments, leaving her apartment building, entering the medical clinic, walking with Reginald in Forest Park. In all of them, her pregnant belly was evident, as was the closeness that seemed to be growing between her and his brother. "What did you find out about her?" he asked the private investigator he had hired, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and questionable methods. Marianne Rivers, 28, nursing technician at St. Margaret's Hospital in Brooklyn. Sick mother with cancer, undergoing treatment at a very expensive private clinic. Until 6 months ago, they were struggling financially. Suddenly, her mother is in the best oncology clinic in the country, and the daughter has a bank account with over $1 million. Richard smiled, satisfied. "Surrogate, as I suspected. My brother has always been practical." "There's more," the investigator continued. "According to sources at the hospital where she works, Marianne took a 6-month leave. Colleagues believe it's to care for her mother, but she continues to show up at the fertility clinic on the Upper East Side regularly, and always accompanied by your brother." "Accompanied?" Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That doesn't make sense. Why would Reginald get personally involved?" "Unless—" He left the sentence hanging, a new possibility forming in his astute mind. "Unless it's not just a commercial contract. Could my brother finally have let his guard down?" The investigator shrugged, indifferent to the personal implications of the case. "There's one more thing that might interest you. The young woman's mother is responding well to treatment, but the doctors aren't optimistic about a complete recovery. The disease is in remission, but it will likely return." Richard absorbed the information with growing interest. A sick, potentially terminal mother, an emotionally vulnerable young woman carrying his brother's child, and Reginald apparently developing feelings for the whole situation. It was perfect. Better than he could have planned. "Keep tracking them," he ordered, handing a thick envelope to the investigator. "I want to know every move, every meeting, every medical appointment. And find the contract. There must be an official document somewhere." When he was alone, Richard poured himself an expensive whiskey and contemplated the city view from his office window in downtown New York City. For years he had lived in the shadow of his older brother, the principal heir, the company president, the natural successor to their parents. Even with all his intelligence and ambition, he had never achieved the recognition he believed he deserved. The news of the pregnancy had initially shaken him. A direct heir to Reginald meant the end of his hopes of taking full control of Vasconcelos Construction. But now, with this new information, a strategy began to form in his mind. If his brother was truly getting emotionally involved with the surrogate mother, that created a vulnerability he could exploit. "Always so controlled, so cold, so calculating," he murmured, raising his glass in a silent toast to his brother's portrait on the wall, a constant reminder of his goal. "But it seems even you have a heart, after all." The next day, in one of Vasconcelos Construction's meeting rooms, Reginald was reviewing the quarter's financial reports when his secretary announced Richard's arrival. Without waiting for permission, his younger brother entered the room with his usual air of confidence. "Impressive profits this quarter," Richard commented, pointing to the charts on the wall screen. "The Philadelphia project exceeded all expectations." "Yes," Reginald replied dryly. "What do you want, Richard?" "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Richard smiled, settling into a chair uninvited. Straight to the point, as always. "I'm here to propose a truce." "Truce?" Reginald raised his eyebrows, surprised. "I didn't know we were at war." "Perhaps war is a strong word," Richard conceded, with a dismissive gesture. "Let's say a prolonged competition. Since our parents' death, you've kept me on the sidelines of the big deals. Understandable, you were the elder, the natural heir. But don't you think it's time we more equitably shared control of the company?" Reginald studied his brother with suspicion. Richard was never one to propose reconciliation. His specialty was manipulation and power games. "Why this approach now? What are you really after, Richard?" "The executive vice presidency," he replied promptly, as if expecting the question. "With real autonomy, and 15% more of the shares I already own." Reginald almost laughed at the audacity. "And why would I agree to that?" Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Because we're the only Vasconcelos left, Reginald. Family. And family should stick together, especially when it's about to grow. Reginald's blood ran cold. The reference couldn't be clearer. Richard knew about the baby. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, maintaining his composure. "Of course you do." Richard smiled, triumphant. "A nurse from Brooklyn, $1 million contract, frequent appointments at the city's best fertility clinic. Or are you going to deny that in a few months you'll be a father?" Reginald maintained an impassive expression, but internally his mind raced. How had Richard found out? Who else knew? And, more importantly, what threat did this pose to Marianne and the baby? "My personal life is none of your business, Richard. Oh, but it is my business when it affects the future of the company, our company." Richard emphasized "our" with obvious irony. "An heir changes everything, doesn't it? Especially one born from such a peculiar arrangement. Are you threatening me?" Reginald's voice acquired a dangerous harshness. "Threatening? Not at all." Richard raised his hands in a gesture of false surrender. "I'm merely highlighting facts. A baby born from a commercial contract, with no emotional ties to the biological mother. Some might question the ethics of that. The press would love the story. Magnate pays millions to buy an heir. Imagine the headlines." Reginald felt a fury he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, he wanted to physically assault someone. He restrained himself, knowing that was exactly what Richard wanted, to see him lose control. "What do you want in exchange for your silence?" he asked directly. "I already told you, the executive vice presidency and 15% more shares. A small price for family discretion, don't you think?" Reginald studied his brother for a long moment. There was something else there, something Richard wasn't revealing. The blackmail seemed almost too contained for his style. "I'll think about it," he finally replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to prepare for." Richard stood up, adjusting his impeccable suit. "Of course, brother. Take your time, but don't take too long. Situations like this have an expiration date, 9 months to be exact." With a final calculating smile, he left the room. As soon as he was alone, Reginald picked up the phone and called his head of security. "I need a complete sweep of my office, my car, and my apartment, immediately. And I want a security team for one person, discreet but efficient." He needed to protect Marianne. If Richard had found out about her, others might too. And his brother clearly hadn't shown all his cards. The blackmail was just the beginning of something bigger. Meanwhile, in the apartment in Queens, Marianne helped her mother prepare for another treatment session. Mrs. Ida, though stronger, still needed assistance with simple activities like dressing and tidying up. "Daughter, that man, the baby's father. He came here yesterday, didn't he?" Mrs. Ida asked as Marianne brushed her hair, now thin due to the treatment. Marianne hesitated. She had told her mother about the walk with Reginald, but not about the proposal to move to his house in Greenwich. She knew the idea would sound strange to Mrs. Ida. Why would a man who had hired a surrogate offer his own home to her and her mother? "Yes, he stopped by," she replied vaguely. "And what is he like? As a person, I mean. He's different from what I initially thought," Marianne admitted, choosing her words carefully. "At first he seemed cold, calculating, but there's something more to him, something he hides." "You like him," Mrs. Ida stated, not as a question, but as a realization. Marianne felt her face flush. "Mom, it's nothing like that. It's just a professional relationship." Mrs. Ida smiled knowingly. "Marianne, I'm your mother. I've known you since you were born. I know when you're developing feelings for someone. And I haven't even met him yet." "It doesn't matter what I feel," Marianne replied, trying to end the subject. "When the baby is born, we'll each go our separate ways. That's what's in the contract. Contracts can be rewritten, daughter." Before Marianne could reply, the doorbell rang. She went to answer it and was surprised to find Patricia looking worried. "Mari, I need to talk to you. It's important." The two went to the small kitchen, leaving Mrs. Ida watching television in the living room. "What's wrong, Pat? You look scared." "Murray, there's a man asking questions about you at the hospital, saying he's a journalist, interested in a story about healthcare professionals. But the questions were strange, very personal, about your life, your mother, your finances." Marianne felt a chill. "What did he look like?" "In his 40s, short hair, professional demeanor. He even showed a newspaper ID, but it seemed fake to me." "What exactly did he ask?" "About your leave, why you left so suddenly. If you were pregnant, whose child it would be? If you had started spending a lot of money lately. Patricia paused. Marie, what's going on? This has to do with that rich man who came to see you, doesn't it? Marianne ran her hands over her face, feeling suddenly exhausted. It's complicated, Pat. He's the baby's father, isn't he? Do you have some kind of arrangement? Please, Pat, the less you know, the better. For your own safety. Patricia's eyes widened. Safety? Marie, are you in some kind of trouble? At that moment, Marianne's cell phone rang. It was Reginald. I need to answer that, she said, moving away from her friend. Reginald's voice was tense, worried. Marianne, we need to talk personally. It's urgent. What happened? I'd rather not talk over the phone. Can I come over now? Yes, of course, she replied, feeling her anxiety grow. When she hung up, she found Patricia looking at her with concern. It was him, wasn't it? Marianne nodded. He's coming here. Marie, whatever's going on, be careful. Don't blindly trust this man just because he's rich or handsome. It's not that, Pat, it's more complicated. Marianne hesitated, not knowing how to explain what Reginald had become to her. He wasn't just the father of the baby she carried, nor just the man who had paid a fortune to save her mother. He was someone who, against all odds, was beginning to occupy a space in her heart. Half an hour later, Reginald arrived, accompanied by a burly man who remained outside the apartment. Patricia, after exchanging meaningful glances with Marianne, said goodbye, promising to call later. Mrs. Ida, who had not yet met Reginald personally, observed him with undisguised interest when Marianne introduced them. The businessman proved to be surprisingly kind and attentive to the older woman, asking about her health, her treatment, demonstrating an interest that seemed genuine. So you're my grandson's father, Mrs. Ida said directly, with the frankness that age and illness had intensified. Marianne told me about your agreement. Reginald, caught off guard by the direct approach, hesitated only an instant before replying, Yes, ma'am. And I am very grateful to your daughter for what she is doing. It's not easy for a mother to know her grandchild will be raised far away, Mrs. Ida continued, ignoring Marianne's warning glance. But I understand that contracts are contracts. Mom, please, Marianne began, embarrassed. It's all right, Reginald interrupted softly. Your mother has every right to express her concerns. Turning back to Mrs. Ida, he continued, Ma'am, I promise your grandson will be very loved and well cared for. And as for the distance, he paused meaningfully, glancing at Marianne. Perhaps it doesn't have to be as absolute as the contract suggests. The words hung in the air, loaded with implications that made Marianne's heart race. What was Reginald suggesting? Mrs. Ida, would you mind if I spoke privately with your daughter for a few minutes? Reginald asked. Of course not. I'll rest a bit in my room. Mrs. Ida rose with difficulty, politely declining Reginald's offered help. Before leaving, she briefly touched his arm. You seem like a better man than Marianne initially described. When they were alone, Reginald quickly explained the situation. Richard's discovery of the pregnancy, the blackmail, the suspicions that they were being watched. It was your brother who sent someone to the hospital to ask questions about me, Marianne concluded. Understanding the gravity of the situation, almost certainly, Reginald agreed. Richard is trying to gather information, possibly to use against us in some way. Against us? Marianne repeated, noticing his choice of words. Not just against you. Reginald approached her, holding her hands with a gentleness that contrasted with his usually controlled demeanor. Marianne, it's no longer just about me or the baby. It's about you, too. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. In recent months, something has changed. Something neither of us planned or foresaw when we signed that contract. Marianne felt her heart pound. Was she really hearing what she thought she was hearing? What exactly changed? She asked, needing confirmation. Everything, he replied simply. What started as a commercial agreement has turned into something more, at least for me. He looked directly into her eyes. And for you? The question hung between them, as direct as it was unexpected. It was the moment of truth, Marianne realized. She could deny it, remain protected behind the formality of the contract, or she could admit what her heart had known for weeks. For me too, she finally admitted, her voice almost a whisper. But I don't know what that means, Reginald. The contract can be rewritten, he interrupted, unknowingly repeating the same words Mrs. Ida had used earlier, or simply forgotten. Marianne felt tears well up in her eyes. It was as if an internal floodgate had opened, releasing emotions she had tried to suppress for so long. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Not just because of your brother, but of all this. Of allowing myself to feel something that may not be real, that may just be the moment, the circumstances." Reginald gently caressed her face, wiping away a tear that fell. "I've been scared too, Marianne. For years I controlled every aspect of my life, keeping everyone at a safe distance. And then you appeared, carrying my child, showing me a humanity I had forgotten existed." At that moment, as if sensing the emotion of the moment, the baby moved vigorously in Marianne's belly. She took Reginald's hand and placed it on the spot, allowing him to feel the movements of his child. "He's agitated today," she commented, with a smile through her tears. Reginald remained silent, marveling at the sensation of the baby's movements under his hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was choked with emotion. "Come with me, Marianne. You and your mother. To the house in Greenwich. Not just for safety, but because I want you close to me." Marianne looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She found none. For the first time, Reginald Vasconcelos was completely open, vulnerable, sincere. "Yes," she finally replied. "We will go with you." Reginald's house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was not just a residence. It was an imposing mansion, protected by high walls and a sophisticated security system. Situated on a large plot of land with well-tended gardens, the modern and elegant design of the building contrasted with everything Marianne knew. "It's big," she commented, as the car passed through the automatic gates after being recognized by security. Reginald smiled, noticing the barely disguised astonishment on her face. "It was one of the first projects I undertook when I took over the construction company. Perhaps a little excessive for someone living alone." Mrs. Ida, sitting in the back seat of the luxury SUV, observed everything in reverent silence. The decision to move had been surprisingly easy for the older woman. After a long conversation with Marianne and getting to know Reginald better, she seemed to have accepted the situation with a serenity that surprised her daughter. "I just want to see you happy, daughter," she had said the night before as they packed their bags. "And this man, however different he may be from our world, seems sincere. I see how he looks at you. It's not the look of someone who is just fulfilling a contract." The move was carried out with military efficiency. The team hired by Reginald took care of packing Marianne's and Mrs. Ida's personal belongings, while the older furniture and appliances were donated to needy neighbors. In less than 24 hours, they had transferred from the small apartment in Queens to the mansion in Greenwich. "I've prepared an entire wing for you," Reginald explained, leading them through the luxurious interior of the house. "Mrs. Ida, your room has a garden view and we've installed medical equipment for your comfort. A nurse will come daily to help with whatever is needed." The idea of having a private nurse initially bothered Marianne. After all, she herself was a healthcare professional. But Reginald gently explained, "I know you would take perfect care of your mother, Marianne, but you also need rest, especially now in your 6th month of pregnancy." He was right, of course. As her belly grew, Marianne felt more tired, and the idea of sharing the care of her mother was comforting. Still, there was something strange about the whole situation. The sudden luxury, the staff at their disposal, the feeling of living a life that wasn't hers. During the first few nights in the mansion, Marianne could barely sleep. The silence was oppressive after years of being accustomed to the constant noise of the New York City suburbs. The mattress was too soft, the Egyptian cotton sheets strange against her skin. Everything seemed excessively perfect, like a 5-star hotel where she couldn't fully relax. In contrast, Mrs. Ida adapted with surprising ease. The older woman, previously so attached to simple routines and a familiar environment, seemed to flourish in the new space. The balanced meals prepared by a private chef, the top-notch medical care, the absolute comfort, all contributed to a visible improvement in her general condition. "Your mother is responding very well to the new environment," commented Dr. Melissa, the oncologist who now made regular visits to the mansion. "Stress is an important factor in fighting cancer, and here she is, visibly more relaxed." Reginald, in turn, surprised Marianne every day. The cold, calculating man from their first meeting had given way to someone attentive, almost anxious to ensure both their comfort. He spent more and more time at the mansion, working from his home office whenever possible, dining with them every night. It was during one of these dinners, 2 weeks after the move, that Reginald finally fully explained the situation with Richard. "My brother always wanted control of the company," he recounted, as the three had tea on the veranda after the meal. "Ever since our parents died, Richard felt overlooked. I was the elder. I naturally assumed leadership of the construction company. Perhaps," he hesitated, as if admitting something to himself for the first time, "perhaps I didn't give him the opportunities he deserved." "Sibling rivalry," Mrs. Ida commented softly. "It's more common than one imagines." "It's not just rivalry, Mrs. Ida. It's something deeper, more calculated. Richard never accepted being second in anything, and when he found out about the baby," Reginald looked at Marianne's belly where his son was growing, "the direct heir threatens all his plans." "Do you think he would be capable of doing something against the baby?" Marianne asked, feeling a chill down her spine. "Not directly," Reginald replied after a moment of reflection. "Richard is more subtle. He will probably try to discredit you, question the validity of the contract, perhaps even try to prove that I am not in a mental state to raise a child." "That's absurd," Marianne protested. "To those who know us, yes. But Richard is convincing, has contacts in the media, and knows how to manipulate public opinion." Reginald paused as if weighing the impact of his next words. "He already offered me a deal, the vice presidency of the company and more shares in exchange for his silence about our situation." "And you're going to accept?" Mrs. Ida asked directly. "No," Reginald replied firmly. "Giving in to blackmail would only be the beginning. Richard would never be content with that." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reginald's lawyer, Maurice, who had been called for an urgent meeting. Mrs. Ida retired to rest, leaving the three alone in the mansion's library. "What did you find out?" Reginald asked as soon as they were settled. "Your brother hired one of the best law firms specializing in family law," Maurice replied, opening his briefcase. "They are studying ways to contest your parental rights when the baby is born." "Based on what?" Marianne asked, alarmed. "Mainly on the original contract," the lawyer explained, looking at her with a grave expression, "which clearly states that you would have no contact with the child after birth. They will argue that there was a breach of contract since you, developed a relationship beyond the commercial agreement." Marianne felt her face burn. It was strange to hear her relationship with Reginald, still so new, so undefined, being discussed in legal terms. "The contract doesn't provide for anything about a relationship between the parties," Reginald argued. "It only stipulates the conditions of the pregnancy and birth." "Technically, you're right," Maurice agreed, "but Richard is preparing an attack on several fronts. If he can't get it legally, he'll try personally. He's already collecting information about Marianne's past, her family, her previous relationships." "How dare he?" Reginald exclaimed, anger evident in his voice. "That's how Richard operates," the lawyer calmly replied. "He looks for vulnerabilities, weak points he can exploit." Marianne felt a tightening in her chest. "And he found something about me." Maurice hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "He's mainly focused on your mother's treatment. He knows how much it costs. He knows you accepted the contract mainly because of that, and he'll try to use that against me," Marianne concluded, understanding. "Paint me as an opportunist who got pregnant for money and is now trying to take even more advantage of the situation." "Exactly," Maurice confirmed. "It's a predictable strategy, but potentially effective, especially if it reaches the media." A heavy silence fell over the room. Marianne felt the baby move, as if sensing her agitation. Instinctively, she placed her hand on her belly, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by Reginald. "We need to anticipate his moves," the businessman finally said. "Maurice, I want you to prepare new documents, a prenuptial agreement." The statement surprised both the lawyer and Marianne, who widened her eyes in shock. "Prenuptial," she repeated, unsure if she had heard correctly. Reginald turned to face her, his eyes reflecting a determination she already knew, but also something new, a glimmer of affection that softened his expression. "Marianne, I know this is sudden and perhaps not the most romantic moment to propose," he paused, searching for the right words. "But I would like you to consider marrying me, not just because of the baby or to face Richard, but because, in recent months, you have become essential to me, in a way I never imagined possible." Maurice, sensing the intensity of the moment, murmured an excuse and discreetly withdrew from the room, leaving them alone. Marianne felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning around her. A whirlwind of contradictory emotions invaded her. Surprise, confusion, happiness, fear. "Reginald, I don't know what to say," she replied honestly. "It's all happening so fast. A few months ago, we were strangers united by a contract. Now I'm living in your house expecting your child, and you're asking me to marry you." "I know it sounds crazy," he admitted, approaching to hold her hands. "I've never been impulsive, you know that. I've always planned every step, every decision. But with you, with our son, everything has changed. For the first time, I'm following what I feel, not what logic dictates." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Marianne looked at their clasped hands, his strong and secure, hers smaller and now slightly swollen from pregnancy. Such different hands, such different lives that fate had decided to intertwine in an unexpected way. "I need time," she finally replied. "I'm not saying no. I just need to process all of this." Reginald nodded, understanding. "All the time you need. The proposal stands." That night, in her room in the mansion, Marianne couldn't sleep. Reginald's proposal echoed in her mind, along with all the implications it carried. Marrying him would mean much more than a legal solution to their problems. It would be a lifelong commitment, a union between completely different worlds. She got up and walked to the window, observing the gardens illuminated by moonlight. Who was she now? Still the simple nurse from Queens, or was she transforming into someone else? And if she married Reginald, would she be able to maintain her identity, or would she be swallowed by his world? A movement in the garden caught her attention. Reginald was walking alone among the trees, apparently as restless as she was. There was something in his solitary posture that touched Marianne deeply. Behind the power and wealth, there was a vulnerable man trying to find his way just like her. The next day, during breakfast, Mrs. Ida noticed the tension between them. With the wisdom of years, she waited until they were alone to approach her daughter. "He proposed to you, didn't he?" Marianne almost choked on her juice. "How do you know?" "I'm old, daughter, not blind," Mrs. Ida replied with a smile. "I saw how he looked at you yesterday, how you two are acting today. And it makes sense, with the baby coming, with his brother plotting." "I don't want to marry out of convenience, Mom," Marianne interrupted, "or out of fear of what Richard might do." "And for love? Would you marry for love?" The question caught Marianne off guard. Love. Was that the word for what she felt for Reginald? For the warmth that spread in her chest when he smiled, for the feeling of security when she was in his arms, for the deep connection that had formed between them through the shared gestation of their son. I think so," she admitted, almost surprised by her own answer. "But it's all so fast, Mum, and our worlds are so different." "Worlds come closer, daughter. People change each other." Mrs. Ida held Marianne's hand tenderly. "I saw how you changed him, and how he changed you too. You're not the same people who signed that contract." Her mother's words stayed with Marianne throughout the day. When Reginald arrived for dinner, she asked to speak with him privately after the meal. In his office, with the door closed to ensure privacy, Marianne finally expressed her fears. "I'm scared, Reginald. Scared of not belonging in your world. Scared that one day you'll realize all this was a mistake, an emotional decision that doesn't hold up to reality." Reginald listened attentively, without interrupting. When she finished, he replied with a calm that conveyed certainty. "Marianne, what I feel for you is not a phase or an impulse. It's something that grew slowly, day after day, week after week. As for our different worlds, perhaps that's exactly what makes us right for each other. You taught me to feel again, to see beyond business and contracts. What if it doesn't work out?" she asked, verbalizing her greatest fear. "What if it does?" he countered with a faint smile. "I'm not asking for guarantees, Marianne. I'm just asking for a chance, for the three of us." Gently, he placed his hand on her belly, where their son stirred as if participating in the conversation. At that moment, looking into Reginald's eyes, feeling the baby move under his hand, Marianne knew her answer. It wasn't a practical or logical decision. It was a decision of the heart. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you." Reginald's expression lit up with an almost childlike joy in its purity. Without words, he pulled her into an embrace, kissing her with an intensity that expressed everything words could not. Preparations for the wedding began immediately. Reginald wanted a small, elegant ceremony before Marianne's pregnancy advanced too much. They agreed on a date 3 weeks later, enough time for the necessary arrangements, but not so much that it would give Richard an opportunity to interfere. Patricia, now aware of the entire situation, helped Marianne choose a dress that gracefully accommodated her almost 7-month belly. Her friend, initially skeptical about the rapid turn of events, gradually became convinced of the sincerity of Reginald's feelings. "I never thought I'd say this," Patricia commented during the dress fitting, "but that man really loves you, Mari. You can see it in his eyes." News of the impending wedding reached Richard through informants he kept at the mansion. The reaction was immediate. An urgent summons of the construction company's administrative board, alleging concerns about Reginald's mental stability. "My brother is making impulsive decisions that threaten the future of the company," Richard argued during the meeting. A hasty marriage to his son's surrogate mother without any proper prenuptial agreement represents a significant patrimonial risk. But Reginald was prepared. With Maurice's help, he had meticulously documented all of Richard's recent actions: the espionage, the blackmail attempts, the veiled harassment of Marianne. When he presented this evidence to the board, the tide quickly turned against his younger brother. "I will not allow personal interests and excessive ambition to threaten this company or my family," Reginald declared firmly before the board members. "Richard will always have his guaranteed place in the construction company, as our father would wish. But his attempts at manipulation and intimidation end now." The board, composed mostly of executives who owed their positions to Reginald, voted unanimously for his continued presidency and for the limitation of Richard's powers within the company. It was a decisive victory, but Reginald knew his brother would not give up easily. On the eve of the wedding, as the final preparations were being completed in the mansion's garden, Richard unexpectedly appeared. Reginald received him alone in the office, prepared for another confrontation. "You won this round, brother," Richard said, pouring himself a whiskey uninvited. "The board, the company, even public opinion. Everyone is on your side now. The powerful Reginald Vasconcelos, regenerated by the love of a simple nurse, ready to become an exemplary father and husband." "What do you want, Richard?" Reginald asked directly, tired of his brother's games. "I came to bring my wedding gift," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My resignation from the construction company. I'm going to follow my own path from now on." The declaration surprised Reginald. He expected more resistance, more maneuvers, not an apparent surrender. "You don't have to leave the company. As I told the board, there will always be a place for you. We are family." "Family," Richard repeated with bitterness. "An interesting word coming from you, who for years treated me as little more than an employee. But don't worry, brother. I hold no grudge. In fact, I sincerely wish you happiness with your new family." There was something in Richard's tone, a contained satisfaction that put Reginald on alert. His brother never accepted defeat gracefully, never retreated without an alternative plan. "What are you plotting, Richard?" "Plotting? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Richard finished his drink and placed the glass on the table. "Just making space for you to live your fairy tale. By the way, how is Mrs. Ida? Is the treatment working well?" The mention of Marianne's mother, seemingly casual, made Reginald clench his fists. "Don't you dare go near her." "Me? Never. I'm just genuinely interested in the health of my future." What would she be? Mother-in-law by proxy? Richard laughed at his own joke. "Anyway, give my regards to your fiancée. Tell her I regret not being able to attend the wedding, but I have urgent business abroad." After Richard left, Reginald remained motionless for long minutes, trying to decipher the true meaning of that encounter. Was his brother strategically withdrawing, or preparing a new blow? Had the mention of Mrs. Ida's health been just a provocation, or a veiled threat? He decided to reinforce the mansion's security, and especially the surveillance on Marianne's mother. He wouldn't tell her about Richard's visit. He didn't want to add more worries to the eve of their wedding. But he would be vigilant, prepared for any move from his brother. That night, in their respective rooms in the mansion, they had decided to follow the tradition of not seeing each other before the ceremony. Both Marianne and Reginald reflected on the journey that had brought them there. From a cold and impersonal contract to a love that defied all probabilities. Marianne, caressing her prominent belly, spoke softly to her son. "Tomorrow we'll officially be a family, little one. A real family, not by contract, but by love." In his office, Reginald looked one last time at the original contract, kept in a safe since the day Marianne moved into the mansion. The cold clauses, the strict conditions, the impersonal legal language, all of it seemed to belong to another life, to another person. With a decisive gesture, he took the contract from the safe and, page by page, tore it into small pieces. They no longer needed that document. What united them now was infinitely stronger, more real, and more lasting than any signed paper could be. The wedding day dawned with a perfect blue sky over the gardens of the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. An elegant tent had been set up among the centuries-old trees, decorated with white and green flower arrangements that created an atmosphere of sophisticated simplicity. Only 30 guests, the closest from both sides, had been invited to the intimate ceremony. Marianne, in her room, watched her reflection in the mirror as Patricia adjusted the last details of the champagne silk dress that draped softly over her 7-month belly. The empire waist design with delicate lace sleeves had been specially designed for her by a renowned stylist, a personal friend of Reginald's. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Ida whispered, watching her daughter with tearful eyes. The older woman, though still fragile from treatment, seemed stronger than ever on that special day, wearing a light blue outfit that highlighted the color gradually returning to her face. "Thank you, Mom," Marianne replied, feeling an emotion she could barely contain. "For everything, for being here." The two hugged carefully, a moment of silent acknowledgement of all they had faced together, the illness, the financial difficulties, the difficult choices that had brought them to that unexpected moment. "Your father would be so proud," Mrs. Ida said, referring to her husband who had passed away years before. "Not for the luxury or the money," she quickly added, "but for the strong and upright woman you've become." A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Mr. Maurice, the lawyer who had become a friend and confidant to the couple in recent months. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, entering after Marianne's invitation. "Just wanted to inform you that everything is ready downstairs, and—" he hesitated briefly. "I personally confirmed that Richard boarded a flight to London last night. There will be no interference today." Marianne nodded, grateful for the information. Although Reginald hadn't told her about his brother's visit the day before, she had noticed his increased concern. The additional security guards, the whispered conversations with Maurice. She knew enough about Richard to fear some desperate action on his part. "Thank you." "Mr. Maurice, you can tell Reginald I'll be down in 15 minutes. When the lawyer left, Patricia helped Marianne with the final touches. A simple tiara of fresh flowers in her loose hair, a subtle touch of makeup that enhanced her natural beauty without masking it. "Ready to become Mrs. Vasconcelos?" her friend joked, adjusting the small train of her dress. "Ready to be the Marianne I chose to be," she replied with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. "With a new last name but the same essence." In the garden under the elegant tent, Reginald waited with an anxiety he had never experienced in billion-dollar negotiations or corporate decisions. Dressed in a light suit that contrasted with his usual sobriety, he seemed younger, lighter. Beside him, as best man, was Charles, his childhood friend and one of the few who knew the man behind the businessman. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Charles commented in a low voice, watching the guests settle in. "Reginald Vasconcelos, the man who turned relationships into contracts, about to say 'I do' before an altar." "I didn't imagine it either," Reginald admitted with a serene smile. "But life has an interesting way of surprising us, exactly when we think we have everything under control." The soft music playing in the background changed to the wedding march, and all eyes turned to the entrance of the tent. Mrs. Ida appeared first, guided by one of Marianne's cousins. Then Patricia, as maid of honor, walked slowly down the aisle formed between the chairs. And then Marianne emerged, radiant in her elegant simplicity, one hand delicately resting on her prominent belly, as if sharing that moment with the child she carried. She walked down the aisle alone, a symbolic choice she had insisted on, representing the independent journey that had brought her there. When her eyes met Reginald's, something passed between them, a mutual understanding, a shared certainty that, despite all odds, they had found in each other exactly what they didn't know they were seeking. The ceremony was brief and moving. They exchanged vows they had personally written, sincere words that spoke of transformation, second chances of families formed not just by blood, but by the daily choices to love and remain. "When I signed that contract," Marianne said in her vows, her voice choked with emotion, "I never imagined I was also signing the beginning of a love story. You taught me, Reginald, that the most perfect plans sometimes need to be abandoned so that we can find what truly matters. And you taught me," he replied in his own vows, "that living within the rules I created to protect myself was merely existing, not living. With you and our son, I am finally learning what it means to truly be alive." When the rings were exchanged and the officiant declared them husband and wife, the applause of the guests mingled with the birdsong in the garden. It was a new beginning, built on the ruins of meticulously laid plans, happily destroyed. The reception that followed was as intimate as the ceremony, an elegant meal served under the trees, genuine conversations, easy laughter. Reginald, usually reserved at social events, surprised everyone with his relaxed demeanor, mingling with guests hand in hand with Marianne, proudly introducing his new wife's friends to members of his social circle. It was during the reception that Maurice's cell phone rang. The lawyer stepped aside to answer it and, minutes later, discreetly approached Reginald. "I need to speak with you privately." In the mansion's office, away from the party, Maurice handed Reginald an envelope. "This arrived at my office an hour ago. It's from Richard." Reginald opened the envelope with apprehension. Inside was a handwritten letter and a second, smaller envelope with Marianne's name on it. "Dear brother," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will already be on my way to a new life in Europe. I have no interest in continuing a war I cannot win. You have always been stronger, more determined. I acknowledge my defeat and withdraw. I leave with you my formal resignation from the construction company and a wedding gift that may mean more to your wife than any jewel or property I could offer." In the smaller envelope, you will find the most recent results of Mrs. Ida's exams, which I obtained through contacts at the clinic where she is treated. Don't misunderstand me. It's not a gesture of kindness. It's merely my recognition that sometimes there are battles not worth fighting. Take good care of your son, Reginald. And remember, not everything in life can be controlled by contracts. Your brother, Richard. With trembling hands, Reginald opened the second envelope. The exam results showed something extraordinary. Mrs. Ida's complete remission from cancer, a result that the doctors who were following her had not yet officially confirmed, perhaps waiting for more tests to be sure. "Unbelievable," Maurice murmured, reading over Reginald's shoulder. "Why would Richard do this?" "Even the hardest hearts have moments of clarity," Reginald replied, still absorbing the meaning of those papers. Or perhaps it's just his way of saying goodbye to a battle he realized he couldn't win. They returned to the party, where Reginald discreetly called Marianne and Mrs. Ida to a quiet corner of the garden. There, away from curious eyes, he shared the news he had just received. Mrs. Ida's reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by tears she did not try to hold back. Marianne, embracing her mother, looked at Reginald with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude that transcended words. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Ida finally whispered. "Her true miracle." "It's the beginning of a new phase for all of us," Reginald replied, wrapping both women in a protective embrace. A complete, healthy, united family. The rest of the celebration unfolded in an almost magical atmosphere of multiplied joy. The news was not shared with the other guests. It would be a moment just for them, a family secret that made that day even more special. As night fell and the last guests departed, Marianne and Reginald remained for a moment alone in the garden, under the starry sky. He held her by the waist, his hand resting on her belly where their son was growing strong and healthy. "You know what's funny?" Marianne commented, resting her head on her now husband's shoulder. "It all started with a contract, a cold, calculated commercial agreement, and it ended with a vow Reginald completed, gently kissing her temple. A promise made not on paper but in the heart. At that moment, as if sealing their parents' pact, the baby moved vigorously, causing both of them to laugh. "He approves," Marianne joked. "He knows he's loved," Reginald corrected. And that, in the end, is all that matters. 2 weeks later, Gabriel Rivers Vasconcelos was born, healthy and strong, bringing with him the perfect conclusion to a story that had begun in such an improbable way. In Marianne's arms, watched by Reginald's emotional eyes and Mrs. Ida's serene expression, little Gabriel represented everything his parents had learned, that the most perfect plans sometimes need to give way to the twists of fate, that contracts cannot contain feelings, and that families are formed not by obligation or convenience, but by daily choices of love and commitment. And so, where before there had been an empire built on contracts and clauses, now blossomed something infinitely more valuable, a family united by love.